Brent and Ryan in the morning. Good morning, I'm Brent.
And I'm Ryan.
And this is
Brent and Ryan in the morning.
Hey, it's Friday, April 5th. We're at the end of week 13, and way to go. We're keeping on through the Immersed Bible Reading Plan. Only 2 more weeks to go after today. And
if you haven't gotten dressed yet, it's Pink Day. Make sure you wear your pink.
Join us, yeah, Pink Friday. So
we didn't realize that. We don't call each other often.
Yeah, he does. No, this week has been fun reading. We're back in a gospel. We're reading all about the stories of Jesus, which honestly I think sometimes I find to be a little bit easier reading because the stories just kind of flow and you move from one story to the next. And so, Ryan, what jumped out at you as we were reading John?
I think we all have our favorite stories.
Yeah.
As we're going through this portion, we see him feeding the 5,000 again, which one of the interesting things we were talking about is which stories are the same in all four
books,
Gospels, because obviously those are the really important ones.
Yeah.
And the feeding of the 5,000 is one of those. But then Jesus develops a little deeper in this book that idea of what it means when he says, I am the bread of life. And he talks about bread, and we have physical food, but there's spiritual nourishment. And this was actually a message that I got to preach just a few months back in the I Am series.
Right, and we'll put the link to that series in the bottom. And it's significant because even though that story of the feeding of the 5,000 is in all four Gospels, what we don't find is those I am statements, which there are 7 of in the Gospel of John. One of them being, I am the bread of life, which you talked about. We also saw in this reading, I am the resurrection and the life, where he raises Lazarus from the dead. And I preached that one in that series as well. Yeah. But it's really kind of an interesting way for us to understand who Jesus said he was from his own words. He's able to describe himself. And as we preach that, we have to admit there was, even though the words changed from bread and gate and resurrection and life, really the theme behind all those was very similar. And we struggled a little bit in preaching those just because, how do we say the same thing again in just a little bit different ways?
Right. So I would make sure to bring up the Old Testament tie too.
That's right.
What Jesus
Which we
was
did
saying
in most
about
of them to try to make sure everybody saw that. Because all of them did have, or most of them did have, resurrection.
So if you haven't picked it up yet, the New Testament is very closely tied to the Old Testament. I feel like we've said that too much.
We've said that a lot. But I mean, it is important because as the famous New Testament scholar and today N.T. Wright would say, the New Testament is the continuing picture of Israel's story. It's the creation that began and coming back to a new creation. And it's the fulfillment of that whole story. And you really can't separate one from the other completely and do it justice. You really do have to understand the writing of the New Testament in light of what was said in the Old Testament.
Yeah, Brent, there was one section when we were talking that you said kind of surprised you. And you're like, well, why didn't his mom just set them straight? Could you explain?
That's right. So in one of the readings, it talked about how his family didn't believe him. And of course, one of his family members was James, the guy we just talked about in the last video.
About it.
Yeah, because that's James, the brother of Jesus. But when we're in John, James is like an antagonist, like my brother was to me growing up.
Right.
And so I just wondered as I read that, I thought, why did Mary not set them straight? Why did she not look at them? I mean, she did have an angel visitor. Joseph had an angel visit him. Yeah. She got pregnant without having sex. That's pretty significant. And if your brothers and sisters are antagonizing you, you'd think mom would step in and be like, now, guys.
And I told Brent as we were having this conversation, that's exactly what happens. My brother and my sister told me I was adopted often and repeatedly. And my mom would always step in and say, Ryan, don't believe them. You weren't adopted. But a part of me always wondered, is she lying to make me feel good? Or are they telling the truth? So I could totally see this being a real situation.
And he still struggles with that a little bit today. I've had to counsel him in my office over that.
I weep.
No, it gives a realism to what John is saying. Sometimes we hold the Bible up, and it is a book to be, it's an authoritative book that we should, model our lives after. But we can lose the sense that this is a very real book, and I think John includes that to just say, not, even his family wasn't there with him. And so as Jesus is teaching, as he's doing miracles, it's not like he had his whole family behind him going, yay, Jesus, you're doing a good job. No, they're all like, dude, crazy.
Yeah, there's a lot of doubters all along the way. And if you're a doubter, that's okay. Jesus has room for you, and he's inviting you and saying, come and see what I did. Come experience how I live.
That's exactly right. You know, one of the things as we were reading John that stuck out to me was something kind of from my past and that I had studied before, but it was just kind of this whole moment where Jesus is talking and he says, you know, I only do what I see my Father doing, and I joined him there. And I kind of shared with you before we recorded today that, you know, I remember going through a study called Experiencing God that really highlighted this aspect of it. And one of the things is it's just a reminder, I think, for all of us that God is not just working here in the New Testament, but he continues to work today. He is revealing that he's working today to us. And when he reveals that to us, it's our invitation. Just like Jesus joined the Father in what he was doing, when we see God working, it's an invitation for us to join him in what he's doing. And I think that's important because sometimes I think we can forget God is still working. No, that's the God of the Bible. No, God is still God today. He's still moving around us, and we're being invited and even drawn into joining him in what he's doing today. And I love that. That's a cool picture of what God's doing. So
and one other thing we just wanted to talk about today, Brent mentioned it last time we met, but we see twice here in the passage where John actually corrects Jesus or adds commentary to Jesus. The irony, like where Jesus is like, the law of Moses talked about circumcision, parenthesis, well, actually that started with Abraham, but we'll go with what Jesus said. And we just thought that's, you know, John apparently was the type of guy who just always had to be right.
Well, and again, we say that when John wrote was later than the original gospel, so he had the time to reflect more and bring these things back into what was being said. There is one thing I think we should address, though, is that if you were reading the Immerse Plan, you notice that when you get in John, there is one section in there that kind of has the bars around it, and it makes the note, this wasn't included in the original manuscripts. And we kind of had this discussion on the end of Mark. And in the end of Mark, we kind of said, you know, we're probably not going to preach on the end of Mark anytime soon, but I have preached this passage of John.
Maybe part of the difference is Mark includes snakes.
Certainly
not a popular passage in the church.
But I think one of the things I think that it's important to keep in mind is that before I preached this passage, I struggled through that a little bit as if it wasn't original to John and it may have been added later. What do we do with that? You know, and as I read through multiple commentaries, you know, every one of them was in agreement that even though it might not have been written originally when John wrote his letter or happened at that time when it's in the story of John, that the consensus was, and even extra biblical literature kind of agrees that this is certainly something that did probably happen, and it certainly reflects the character of Jesus that John lays out in the rest of the book. So there's nothing like go handle some snakes here. No, Jesus just forgives a woman and tells people to stop judging and, you know, consider their own sin first, which is certainly in line with all the gospel narratives that we find of Jesus. So
we can take that, we can read it, we can pull something out of it and go, you know what, because the story does have a great application.
It's a powerful story.
Of, you know what, let's not throw stones at other people for their sin. All of us have our own sin.
We should all listen to that. So all right, well, we're going to keep reading through John this week. No, next week, forgive me. And we're going to get through the Gospel of John. We're going to read other letters that John wrote, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John.
If he, in fact, wrote them.
We'll have to talk about that now. Thanks a lot.
Whoa, teaser.
That's right, teaser. So, but we'll get to that next week. And so I hope that you're still with us. Keep trucking, and we'll see you guys next time. Thanks for joining us.